A war can begin while everyone is still talking about peace. That is the paradox dominating this week in the Middle East. As Washington and Tehran approach newly announced negotiations, an Iranian drone heads toward a U.S. warship, armed speedboats harass a U.S.-flagged oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, and the United States deploys at least 9 warships, dozens of fighter jets, and up to 40,000 troops across the region. Fact. Officially, this is about building leverage ahead of nuclear talks scheduled for Friday in Oman. But for you, the risk is immediate. This maritime corridor controls a critical share of global energy flows, and a single spark here can hit prices, markets, and global stability. Fact. Now pay close attention to this sentence. According to Washington, if talks fail, military options are already prepared. Inference. These negotiations may not be designed to reach an agreement, but to prevent something far worse, and that is where the story truly begins. What is set to happen on Friday did not emerge out of nowhere. Just a week ago, none of these talks were officially planned. Fact. Then suddenly, as protests shake Iran and repression intensifies, Washington's tone hardens, military threats increase, and a diplomatic channel opens. Fact. Officially, the purpose of the meeting is clear: Iran's nuclear program. But that framing is incomplete. U.S. officials say they also want to limit ballistic missiles, halt support for regional armed groups, and end internal repression. Fact. Tehran, for its part, rejects everything except the nuclear file. Fact. So the question is not simply whether a deal is possible. The real question is why these talks are happening now, under this specific military pressure, at this precise moment. Notice what is missing from public discourse. No one talks about trust. No one talks about mutual concessions. And that is where the narrative shifts, because this negotiation looks less like a search for agreement and more like a test of nerve. Here is the central message Washington is sending without stating it outright. The military option is not theoretical. It is ready. Fact. President Trump says Iran's supreme leader should be worried about the U.S. military buildup in the Middle East. Fact. This is not vague rhetoric. On the ground, the United States already has at least 9 warships, dozens of fighter aircraft, and between 30 and 40,000 troops in the region. Fact. That detail changes everything because it turns diplomacy into a strategic countdown. A U.S. source explains that if talks go badly, it could push the president to take further military action. Fact. Now note what is never denied. No one in Washington says these forces are there only to deter. No one says they will leave if talks fail. Inference. Pressure is not background scenery. It is the primary tool of the discussion. And when force becomes the normal backdrop to diplomacy, the threshold for escalation drops dangerously. This is where the situation begins to accelerate. At this stage, escalation no longer comes as a surprise, but through habit. Fact. Maritime incidents, drones, harsh statements, then talks announced, canceled, and reinstated within hours. Fact. This back and forth has become normal, and that is precisely the danger. The more the cycle repeats, the higher the tolerance threshold rises. Consider the comparison often made behind closed doors. Washington has already carried out a quick and localized operation elsewhere without deploying ground troops, and President Trump views that operation as a success. Fact. But here, the comparison breaks down. Iran is not the same terrain. Regional actors know it, and Trump knows it too. Fact. Yet today's language still evokes the idea of a short, controlled, almost surgical strike. Inference. This is how something abnormal slowly becomes acceptable, talking about strikes, regime pressure, extreme coercion, while calling it diplomacy. So ask yourself this: at what point does repeated escalation stop being a tactic and become a slippery slope? Because the next piece of the puzzle makes this game far more dangerous. Here is the most revealing evidence so far. Behind the cameras, the very subject of the talks nearly caused them to collapse. Fact. Iran demands that Friday's meeting focus exclusively on the nuclear issue, nothing else. Fact. Washington initially refuses. U.S. officials argue that any meaningful deal must also include ballistic missiles, regional proxies, and internal repression. Fact. Then abruptly things shift. The talks are confirmed, and according to U.S. officials quoted in the media, this first round will deal only with the nuclear issue. Fact. This detail fundamentally changes how the situation should be read. It exposes a clear contradiction between the public rhetoric of firmness and the compromise quietly accepted behind the scenes. Inference. Under the pressure of regional escalation, Washington chooses to unlock the discussion rather than hold every red line. Notice what is never publicly explained. Why accept now what was declared unacceptable just hours earlier? That is where it becomes clear that the true objective may not be an agreement, but slowing a spiral already slipping out of control. From there, everything accelerates. Fact. First, talks are announced as canceled. Then, hours later, they are confirmed again. Fact. Next, Iran's foreign minister publicly states that nuclear talks will indeed take place. Fact. Washington does not contradict this version. Fact. At the same time, media outlets cite U.S. officials confirming that this first round will be limited to nuclear issues with others postponed. Fact. 3 rapid moves, 3 signals of lost control. This is no longer a slow, deliberate strategy. It is crisis management under pressure. Inference. Each side is primarily trying to buy time, calm the immediate front, without addressing the core issues. And while statements change by the hour, ships remain in position, aircraft stay deployed, and troops do not move. Fact. Diplomacy advances, but the military machine does not slow. So ask the question everyone avoids. What happens if this rhythm continues? If diplomatic announcements merely delay the inevitable without diffusing tension? Because at that point, a single spark is enough. Now bring this back to your daily life. Not abstract geopolitics, but its concrete effects. Fact. The Strait of Hormuz is not a symbol. It is a real passage through which a vital share of the world's oil and gas flows. Fact. When armed boats harass a tanker there, it is not distant theater. It is a direct threat to energy supply, prices, and economic stability. Inference. Escalation here does not begin with dramatic explosions on screen. It starts with nervous markets, soaring insurance costs, avoided shipping routes, and rising prices passed on to consumers. Fact. That is why so many countries in the region panic quietly. They know they would be hit first, even without being officially at war. Inference. If this tension feels familiar, if it seems like decisions taken far away always end up affecting your wallet, say it out loud. Because what comes next depends not only on leaders, but on the system that makes this kind of crisis repeatable. To understand why this keeps happening, you have to look at the mechanism, not the speeches. Fact. None of the key actors wants a full-scale war right now. And yet, all of them behave as if escalation is an acceptable tool. Inference. Why? Because the system rewards visible pressure. Military displays create urgency, urgency forces concessions, and temporary concessions buy political time. Fact. For Washington, showing ships and aircraft reassures allies and intimidates opponents. For Tehran, provoking without crossing the red line shows it is not cornered. Fact. The problem is that this game turns risk into routine. No one wins by calmly stepping back. Everyone wins by pushing just far enough. Inference. That is why diplomacy happens under threat, and threat becomes permanent. This is not an exceptional crisis. It is a mode of operation. And when a system works this way, it does not stop because someone wants peace, but only when the cost becomes too high. The unsettling question is simple. Who pays that cost first if this dynamic continues? In the short term, 2 paths emerge and neither is stable. Fact. The first is the one many quietly hope for. On Friday, both sides declare they are committed to diplomacy, that they want to de-escalate, and a timetable for talks is set. Fact. Nothing is resolved, but pressure drops just enough to avoid an immediate shock. Inference. Forces remain deployed, sanctions stay in place, and everyone buys time. The second path is far more fragile. It begins if one side believes the other is using talks as cover. Fact. In that scenario, a maritime incident, a misjudged statement, or indirect action via allied groups can shatter the diplomatic framework. Inference. And remember this recent precedent. A diplomatic delay was granted 60 days, and on the 61st day at 3 in the morning, strikes began. Fact. That detail is never forgotten in the region. Inference. That is why even if Friday goes well, no one will speak of relief. They will speak of delay. And when a crisis merely buys time, the question is no longer whether something happens, but when and in what form. At its core, this entire sequence rests on a dangerous illusion, the belief that talking is enough to control escalation. Fact. In reality, what is at stake here is not just a nuclear deal or a diplomatic failure. It is the normalization of a world where military pressure becomes the default language and diplomacy exists mainly to postpone impact. Inference. Re-examine the whole story through that lens. Drones, ships, statements, canceled and reinstated talks all point to the same systemic reflex. Fact. The goal is not resolution, but short-term risk management. And the more risk is managed, the more it accumulates. Inference. That is why the real question is not what happens on Friday, but what this model produces over time. Each cycle leaves less room, less credibility, and more tension. If you want to understand why these crises keep chaining together, why they always seem to avoid disaster without ever diffusing it, stay here. Because this story does not end with these talks. It merely sets the stage for the next act.